The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, why Social Security isn't going broke and how expanding it will help all of us. Who wins and who loses under Trump's renegotiated NAFTA. Plus, DNC Chair Tom Perez tells Bill Press how history will judge Donald Trump and the Republicans who support him. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. President Trump's hoping to fast-track his renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement with a promise that he has the best plan for American workers. Arthur Stamoulis says the plan falls far short of that promise and a lot more work is needed for a NAFTA replacement to benefit working people and the planet. And we say hello to Arthur Stamoulis, Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign, which is a national coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, consumer, and human rights organizations working together for trade policies that promote a just and sustainable global economy. Arthur Stamoulis, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. So we're beginning to see a lot of activists organizing against NAFTA 2.0, which, as most people would remember, is President Trump's plan to reshape North American trade. Your organization has been at the forefront of that. And beginning with jobs, what are your primary concerns about NAFTA 2.0?
Yeah, when the original NAFTA was being debated in the early 90s, we were told it was going to create jobs and lift wages for workers in all three countries. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Large employers took advantage of NAFTA to move jobs from the U.S. and Canada down to Mexico to take advantage of sweatshop wages, work rights abuses, and the ability to dump toxins with impunity. So for workers in the United States, what this has meant is roughly 1 million good-paying middle-class jobs have moved to Mexico under NAFTA, with more jobs lost every week. And it's putting a very real downward pressure on the wages and the benefits of the jobs that we have left. So we want to change that. Donald Trump got into the White House in no small part by promising he was going to make NAFTA much, much better for working Americans. Unfortunately, his proposed NAFTA revision does not make the changes that are needed to stop outsourcing and stop the race to the bottom in wages. And that's why you see corporate lobby groups currently spending millions of dollars trying to convince Congress to pass NAFTA 2.0 as written, while unions and other civil society groups are saying, not so fast. This is a deal that doesn't deserve to be enacted unless and until there are much stronger labor and environmental provisions with swift and certain enforcement so that companies can no longer use this pact to aid in outsourcing. I've got to mention also, not only does the White House NAFTA proposal fail to make the changes that are needed to protect jobs, to raise wages, to defend worker rights, to safeguard the environment, but it also includes new language snuck in at the request of big pharmaceutical companies that's designed to lock in high medicine prices. There's new language in this proposal that would guarantee monopoly rights for the makers of high-tech biologic medicines that are used to treat cancer, to treat arthritis, to treat other serious conditions, and thus block competition from generic medicine makers and keeping prices here outrageously high. That's something that absolutely needs to change too.
Is there any advancement? You mentioned workers' rights. Is there any advancement in terms of workers' rights?
Most of the language in the NAFTA 2.0 labor chapter is very, very similar to the weak, ineffectual labor standards that we saw in trade deals that were developed under the George W. Bush administration. Not strong enough to protect worker rights abroad, not strong enough to protect jobs at home. There is, however, one annex in the current NAFTA proposal that we really do like, and it's designed to tackle the issue of protection unions in Mexico. One of the major reasons why real manufacturing wages have been declining over the past 25 years under NAFTA instead of rising is that when a company decides to build a new factory there, they will often sign a contract with a corrupt protection racket union before the first worker is even hired. You know, the company pays the union directly. Workers often don't even know they belong to a union unless they try to form an independent union of their own, at which point they're told they're already under contract and the changes that they're trying to make in their workplace are illegal. So the new NAFTA proposal does include an annex requiring Mexico to pass, implement, and maintain laws that are designed to give workers a real say in their union contracts. And Mexico, in fact, recently passed a law at the federal level designed to do just that. The problem is that the protection unions there have already teamed up with business groups that have launched 96 separate lawsuits designed to attack the new labor law. They've promised to introduce legislation at the federal level next session that would weaken the new law before it's even implemented. And in fact, they've already succeeded in passing laws at the state level designed to weaken worker rights in a number of ways, including by eliminating the right to strike. So, you know, even if it weren't under attack under these ways, the new labor law, you know, is going to require hiring hundreds of new judges and inspectors to review the approximately 700,000 protection union contracts in Mexico. And as I understand it, not a single dollar has yet been allocated to do that. So what we're saying is any final NAFTA deal needs to include swift and certain enforcement mechanisms to ensure that this new annex on protection unions is actually implemented and enforced moving forward, and that other labor and environmental standards are upheld moving forward. I'll say, under existing U.S. trade agreements, labor advocates have tried enforcing the labor provisions of these deals on 50 separate occasions. Some of those cases have taken upwards of a decade to reach a decision on them, and not a single one of those 50 cases has ever resulted in relief for working people. We've lost all of them on one technicality or another, and so Trump's NAFTA proposal actually includes this gaping loophole that would even allow countries to block arbitration panels from hearing labor cases, before they're even seated. So that needs to change. We need stronger standards, and there need to be swift and certain enforcement mechanisms to make them worth the paper they're written on. And that's one of the things that the labor movement in this country has been very, very clear on.
You know, you can make up all the laws you want. I mean, if there's nobody, if nobody's watching the hen house, the fox is going to have its day no matter what. I mean, it just, it seems like, Mexico, yeah, we got all these new laws. It's right there with NAFTA 2.0, but there's no enforcement, then nothing has changed, basically.
That's absolutely right. And we saw, for instance, under the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, murder's already illegal in Colombia. Like, we don't need new laws. What we need is the enforcement of these laws, and the basic respect for worker rights in these countries. If we want to see a leveling of the playing field, if we want to see wages abroad start to raise and jobs from this country stop being outsourced to take advantage of those poor conditions.
Yeah. Now, Arthur, does NAFTA 2.0 say anything about climate change?
No, it doesn't even mention the term climate change. And worse than that, it preserves special rights for oil and gas companies that are operating in Mexico to actually attack any future environmental rules as what's called an indirect expropriation. In other words, hey, we invested in oil and gas development in Mexico under a certain regulatory regime. Now you're passing climate laws or clean air laws or clean water laws that are going to cost us money. Well, we're now allowed to seek damages for those new laws, including for the loss of expected future profits. And these are cases that unbelievably would not be heard under the Mexican judicial system or the U.S. judicial system or any other country's judicial system, but instead in front of unaccountable panels of 3 corporate trade attorneys through a process called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It is outrageous, and it's why groups like the Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth and many others are saying that this deal simply does not cut it.
We're speaking with Arthur Stamoulis, Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign. What's your sense, Arthur, of the political moment? Does it seem likely this will reach the president's desk as is?
Well, right now, Speaker Pelosi is saying that she doesn't intend to allow this pact to move forward unless and until substantive changes are made on labor, the environment, enforcement, access to medicines. In fact, in recent weeks, 17 of the leading Democratic presidential candidates told us essentially the same thing, that the new NAFTA proposal should not be enacted unless and until stronger labor and environmental terms with swift and certain enforcement get added, and language on pharmaceutical monopolies that locks in high medicine prices is removed. So that's good. Right now, House Democrats in the White House are negotiating with one another to see if any changes are still possible. This, frankly, might be one of the only areas where Congress and the White House is negotiating in earnest. But I'll say, my view is that at some point soon, I suspect push is going to come to shove, and the president will try to ram this deal through Congress as written. And so we're urging Congress to hold strong, to insist that there be no vote on NAFTA 2.0 until it's fixed. And the bottom line here is that working Americans cannot afford a rebranded NAFTA deal that makes some tweaks around the edges, but that continues to allow jobs to be outsourced and that actually has new giveaways for big pharma. That's unacceptable. And so we're really counting on Congress to stand firm in the face of the president's bullying.
I can't help but think that all NAFTA 2.0 is just kind of a rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, it doesn't feel like anything has changed. There
are some provisions like the labor annex I mentioned that, with the addition of swift and certain enforcement could be game changers. But the way it's written right now, unfortunately, you're right. I mean, this is a rebranding. President Trump makes a big deal that he's renamed this the U.S. Canada-Mexico Agreement, the USMCA. The problem with NAFTA was never its name, right?
Right.
The problem with NAFTA was that it made it easier for big corporations to outsource jobs. And so, as written, the deal, unfortunately, is a lot more of the same.
Yeah. Now, one of the goals of your organization is to increase the role of Congress in trade issues. How would this happen, and how would it make a difference?
Yeah, for too long, Congress has really ceded its constitutional authority over trade policy to the executive branch through a process called fast track. Fast track is a law that allows whoever is president to negotiate a trade agreement with whatever country it likes, to present that deal to Congress when the negotiations are completed as a take it or leave it deal. And then, it is rushed through Congress, circumventing ordinary debate, review, and amendment procedures that we have in place for any other sort of law that the Congress would make. So looking ahead, what we've proposed and what we'd like to see Congress enact is a process whereby there's certain readiness criteria established for which countries we will and will not, enter into new trade negotiations with. And then we need to spell out, what are things that absolutely must be in any future trade agreement and what are things that can't be in any future trade agreement. And we feel like if Congress would take this responsibility seriously, we'd have trade policies that were much, much better for working people on the planet. Unfortunately, that's not been the case to date.
Well, and of course, trade can seem, like an arcane topic. So how do you manage to get activists and the general public invested in this issue? Because it's not a front burner issue for most people.
Yeah, and I'll say, most people don't spend a lot of time looking at any piece of public policy, but trade in particular can be very wonky, very complex. There's a lot of acronyms, and I get that. But what people need to understand is that these are the policies that affect jobs and wages in our community. They affect human rights abroad, and they absolutely have a major impact on the quality of the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and climate change moving forward. And one of the things that attracted me to trade work when I first got involved with this in the late 90s is that this is actually an issue that brings together progressive movements, across issue area and across borders. Our coalition is made up of labor, environmental, family farm, faith, consumer groups, others, who all understand that these are essentially corporate power grabs. These deals are about who gets to write the rules that affect the global economy. Is our global economy set up to benefit working people and to create a more just and sustainable society moving forward? Or are they set up to enrich and empower corporate elites? For too long, it's been set up to enrich and empower corporate elites. And, we've shown in recent years that when we work together, we can stop many of the worst proposals. Going back, we stopped the expansion of the World Trade Organization during the battle in Seattle. We stopped the plan to expand NAFTA to the entire Western Hemisphere, except for Cuba. It's called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. We stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think if we take advantage of this moment, we can certainly stop NAFTA from becoming worse. And if we really grab hold of the moment, we might actually be able to get a replacement deal that provides real benefits for working people in all three countries. And that's what we're fighting for.
Well, it's wonderful work that you're all doing. As you mentioned, it is a national coalition, labor, environmental, family, farm, consumer, and many others. Arthur Stamoulis, we appreciate your time with us today. Arthur, of course, Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon to get an update.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
You're quite welcome. It's our pleasure to have you with us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, building on the promise of Social Security and confronting the myths. Hint, it's not going bankrupt. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The most ridiculous thing about Donald Trump's xenophobic, demagogic assault on Central American amnesty seekers is that his frantic demand to build a $5 billion border wall is not his most ridiculous ploy. Even more ridiculous is his panicky political assertion that the caravans coming north through Mexico are gangs of rapists, murderers, and terrorists out to slaughter and conquer us. Never mind that the migrants he demonizes are overwhelmingly women, children, and peaceful families who are fleeing the terrifying gangs, extortionists, and corrupt officials who've turned their lives in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras into hell. But rather than greet these refugees with a policy of common compassion and long-term solutions, Trump and his fellow Republican screechers have militarized the border to separate them from their children, incarcerate them, and turn them into political pawns for Trump's re-election campaign. But wait, it gets more ridiculous. Crying that the three countries should bar these desperate families from fleeing the horrors of home, Trump has peevishly and stupidly cut off U.S. aid intended to battle the gang violence driving them northward. Okay, Trump has no empathy or subtlety, but how smart do you have to be to see that if you have no strategy to help mitigate the nightmarish conditions of your neighbors, you'll have to cope with the fallout on your own doorstep? This is Jim Hightower saying, most ridiculous of all, though, is that we have a president with a moral compass that points only to policies that serve his ego and political needs. Trump doesn't really want any border solution at all, not even a wall. He wants a crisis, a bugaboo to demagogue for his own political advancement, no matter how many families suffer. He's a pathetic weakling of a president, ridiculously masquerading as a strong man.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. On August 14, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into law the Social Security Act. It remains one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. Few can speak better to that than Nancy Altman. Countering the many myths used to discredit Social Security, she says it's time to fight to increase, not cut the program. And we say hello to Nancy Altman, president of Social Security Works and the author of The Truth About Social Security. The founder's words refute revisionist history, zombie lies, and common misunderstandings. Nancy Altman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You recently released a statement that a new college affordability plan, introduced by Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal, would carry on FDR's legacy. Now, we normally don't think about college when we think of FDR's legacy. So how do you see it as part of his vision?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Franklin Roosevelt and the others who created Social Security had a really expansive view of its meaning. They saw it as synonymous with economic security. They understood to be economically secure, you had to be healthy, so they wanted universal health insurance. They knew you had to be well educated, which is where the Sanders-Jayapal bill comes in. You needed a guaranteed job at a living wage. And then, if you lost those wages, you needed what we now call Social Security, which is wage replacement, insurance against the loss of wages in the event of old age, disability, or death. Today, we think of what that last part as Social Security, and it's an extremely important part of FDR's legacy. But he understood Social Security, and in fact, our organization, Social Security Works, understands that it is as important as Social Security is. It's a piece of much larger economic security that all of us should have and all of us deserve.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as one might guess, your book, The Truth About Social Security, confronts a number of myths about the program. One of the most common is that it's going bankrupt. How true or not true is this?
It is absolutely false. Social Security is extremely conservatively financed and very closely monitored. Every year, starting from the moment monthly benefits first started getting paid, Social Security, the law requires that the trustees, because the money that we all contribute from our pay is kept in trust with a board of trustees. The Congress requires that those trustees report every single year to them about the income and outgo of Social Security. They don't look ahead just 10 years, 20 years. They look ahead 3/4 of a century. Now, the program's only barely older than 3/4 of a century, but we've been doing that to ensure that there will always be money there. When you project that far ahead, you are going to see unexpected surpluses, unexpected shortfalls, and indeed there is a modest shortfall starting about 2035. The program is 100% funded until then. It's 93% funded for the next 25 years, 88% funded for the next 50 years. No, it's got to be brought up to 100%. But most people, if you say, you can pay all your bills for the next 15 years and 93% of them for the next 25 years today, you may need to get a little more income. You go, wow, that's pretty good. Most people would not consider that bankrupt.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm just sitting here doing the math in my head, figuring how long I have. So,
yeah, most people are happy if they've got enough for a few months.
Right. Oh, yeah. No kidding. It's tougher and tougher out there these days. Nancy, another myth that you take on is that Social Security is a three-legged stool. Explain the metaphor and why it's incorrect.
Well, it's important to understand that the metaphor came from, it was coined in 1948 by an insurance broker who was trying to sell supplemental policies to Social Security. What the metaphor says is that our retirement income system has three legs: Social Security, private pensions, and savings. Now, the image is wrong because a stool has to have three equal legs or it's going to tip over, and those legs have never been equal. Social Security has always been the most important part and often the only part of people's retirement income. About 1 out of 3 seniors rely on Social Security for virtually all of their retirement income. 2/3 rely on it for more than half their income. So it's misleading, but it also is not, doesn't really fit the intent. The idea, there is no reason that Social Security couldn't be much more adequate than it is. Our benefits are extremely modest by virtually any standard. And what I think the founders thought, and what those of us who are see ourselves as carrying on their legacy would like to see Social Security expanded, certainly not cut.
You centered your book on the words and vision of the founders of Social Security. Why was this so important?
It's important for several reasons. One is, one of the things that frustrates me, and why part of the reason I wanted to write the book, is that you often hear revisionist history, people saying, oh, they never intended benefits to be larger, they never intended this, they never intended that, as ways of scaling back, trying to curtail what Social Security is. So I wanted to go back and really look at, well, what did they say? What did they intend? And really what I found was, and you often hear, oh, they never recognized today's program. What I found was not only would they recognize today's program, they would certainly recognize it, but they'd be surprised that that we hadn't expanded it more. They saw what we now call Medicare for All, universal guaranteed health insurance. They thought that was right around the corner. They almost proposed it in 1935. So that was one important reason that I think it's important to go back to their words. But another piece of it is that the program has stood the test of time. It's extremely successful. It's more successful than its private sector counterparts. It is, the benefits it provides are better, more secure, and it provides them more efficiently. It spends less than a penny of every dollar on administration, and 401ks often hidden fees, but can be 10, 15, 20%. So it's very efficient, very secure, and very fair. So that it doesn't mean that we have to be locked into what the founders wanted, but we should at least be aware of it, because I think by looking at what they did, we get an understanding of why the program works so well, what's so valuable about it, and changes we make will build upon what they did rather than undermine, as long as that's what we want to do. But we should be knowledgeable about it, knowing about it.
You would really like it if today's politicians had the foresight of those founders of Social Security in the 30s. We're speaking with Nancy Altman, president of Social Security Works, author of The Truth About Social Security: The Founders' Words Refute Revisionist History, Zombie Lies, and Common Misunderstandings. Nancy, as a candidate for president, Trump promised to protect Social Security. You've written recently about what you call a sneak attack. What is he trying to do?
Well, so again, thank you so much for this question, because prior to Donald Trump running for president, he said a lot of anti-Social Security things. He said we should raise the retirement age. It would be better privatized. He called it a Ponzi scheme. But he also said well before he ran that Republicans would be fools to try to cut the program on a partisan basis because they'd lose elections. And sure enough, when he ran for president, he said he would not cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Indeed, he's proposed all three in his budget and in the people he appointed. The sneak attack is a little bit different. So he's proposed outright cuts in his budget, although they have not gotten anywhere because there's a Democratic control of the House. But he also has what I called a sneak attack, and that is that there is something, one of Social Security's very valuable protections is that it's every year there's an automatic adjustment for inflation. If you are receiving a wage replacement in the form of Social Security today and you don't get any inflation adjustment, 30 years from now, that benefit is going to be really eroded in value. So having an annual inflation is extremely important. Now, the current inflation way inflation is measured is inadequate, and we've been urging that it be a better measure, a more accurate measure that would have those benefits rise faster is what is needed. But opponents of Social Security, and some who just are, I think, not opponents, but just not expert in it, have tried something called the chained CPI. Anyone who has followed this issue carefully over the last half dozen years know that this was a big issue about 5 or 6 years ago, where elites in Washington were trying to come up with a stingier Social Security index in a very wonky way. But that got defeated. So the Republicans and Donald Trump have a kind of sneak attack to get where they want to go. They indexed the tax brackets to the chained CPI in their latest, in that tax bill that they passed. And now they are trying to change just by executive order. Trump is trying to change the federal poverty level, the way it is measured and the way it's increased, again, by the chained CPI. Now, it's not going to make anyone less poor if they use a different index, but it will count people lower. It will cut their benefits. It won't affect Social Security directly, but I see a kind of circling the wagons, that it's, or a sort of, rather a kind of ambush, that everything else will be indexed to the chained CPI, things that people are not objecting to. I think there's actually good reason to index the tax brackets by that, because those tend to be more affluent people and they do have more discretionary income. But affecting Social Security this way is, once they've done everything else, they can say, well, come on, everything else is, let's be consistent. But it is a sneak attack on our earned benefits.
Yeah, it certainly is. And before we let you go, in keeping with the original vision of the founders, how would you like to see Social Security change?
I would like to see the benefits substantially increased. The benefits are modest by virtually any standard. They are in absolute terms. They're just around the average benefits, just around the poverty level. In terms of percent of replacing of wages, experts think you need about 70% replaced. Under current laws, someone earning about $50,000 will only get about 40% replaced, which is not enough to maintain your standard of living. And indeed, by international standards, our benefits are very low. So the very first thing I'd like to see is the benefits increase substantially in size. I also think, given the income and wealth inequality, we should be introducing some additional revenue that is progressive. There's a little bit of progressive revenue now. Most of the revenue comes from our contributions that are paid from all of our paychecks and matched by our employers, and that should be the substantial way that its benefits are financed, and it will be in the future. But a little bit, 5%, 10% from a progressive source, whether it's Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, whether it's a surtax on millionaires on their income tax. There are a variety of sources we could use, but I think those are the two big changes I would make, to substantially increase benefits and pay for the modest shortfall and the substantial increase with progressive revenue coming from those who have gotten so much from the Commonwealth, all of our wealth. The billionaires and billionaires are not now paying their fair share, and they should.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Nancy Altman, president of Social Security Works and the author of The Truth About Social Security, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Nancy, we appreciate your time with us. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with DNC Chair Tom Perez about why he says Donald Trump is the most dangerous president in history.
So let me start out by asking you and I have been around politics a long time, you and the Justice Department also, and we know that politics can be a rough and tumble game, and Republicans and Democrats engage in lively debate on the issues about how we can best move this country forward. Did you ever think you would see a day when the President of the United States would tell 4 Democratic members of Congress they ought to go back where they came from?
No, I didn't, Bill. Every week we reach new lows. I've stopped saying you're not going to believe what happened this week, because every week there's something that so far exceeds the bounds of civility and what we should be doing as a democracy that we just have to stop saying that. And this president is the most dangerous president in American history. And I say that with Richard Nixon and others in mind. And that's why I ran for this job, because I knew our democracy was on fire back in 2016 when I announced my running. I totally underestimated the extent of the 5-alarm blaze. And that's why it's so important for us as Democrats to remain focused on defeating Donald Trump. This is a democracy imperative.
Do you think he's a racist?
I think he has said so many things that are racist. I think he has used race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religion and gender, for that matter, to divide our country. Our leaders should be uniting us, not dividing us. Our leaders, the easiest layup he had in his presidency was Charlottesville. That was an easy issue to absolutely denounce. And when you sit there and say both sides have a good point, that's just not right. That's offensive. And so he continues to divide our nation along these fault lines, and he continues to engage in the politics of zero sum. You can only succeed if the immigrant fails. That's not who we are as a nation. I think the most enduring symbol of our democracy is the Statue of Liberty, and Lady Liberty's been taking some body blows, but Lady Liberty is resilient, and the American democracy is resilient, and we're going to make sure he's a one-term president.
You have served as a member of a president's cabinet. Were you in the cabinet when the president of your party said something like that? What would you do?
I'd get up and walk out, but I never had to worry about that. Remember when scandal was Obama wearing a tan suit one June or July day? That was the definition of scandal on Team Obama. And here we have not only the president saying things that are so divisive, he's the commander in chief. There's conduct unbecoming an officer is what people in the military get charged with. This is conduct unbecoming a president. And then when you have the culture set from the top, it should come as a surprise to no one that you have all of these cabinet secretaries who've had to step down amid scandal, whether it was the HHS secretary. That's like 15 scandals ago, Bill. And then most recently, the labor secretary, and so many in between, and some who are still serving while we're buying China for tens of thousands of dollars, wasting taxpayers' money. Imagine if the tables were turned and you had a Hillary Clinton administration with cabinet secretaries doing even one of the things that these Republicans have done. You would have 48 hearings, and you would have Republican outcry, and now you have the appalling silence. And that's where history will judge this party so harshly, because the McConnells of the world, the appalling silence in the face of such absolute statements that are just absolutely inappropriate, uncalled for, conduct that is uncalled for, conduct that borders on criminal, and there are investigations underway in some cases, and the appalling silence of the Mitch McConnells of the world and the Paul Ryans before him. They are both, history will treat them harshly.
And Kevin McCarthy today.
Kevin McCarthy today.
What does it tell you about the Republican Party, this deafening silence on the part of the leadership up and down the line?
The party of Lincoln is dead. The party of Lincoln, which was once the party of civil rights, is dead. It's been replaced by the party of Trump. The party of Trump is a party of extremism on every front. They don't want capitalism, because capitalism that is inclusive is a capitalism that gives opportunity for everyone. Their one bill that they've passed is a bill that provides reckless tax cuts for people who didn't need it and corporations who don't deserve it. That's their quote-unquote signature accomplishment. And what that has done is that has made our capitalism more difficult to work. You know, the Democrats are the party that brought us Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act and the labor movement. And what all those things had in common is that Republicans who opposed them called them socialism. Mm-hmm. Those weren't socialism. Those capitalism without guardrails is not capitalism. And all of those things that we fought for, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act, that is what has given capitalism the guardrails that it needs and have given opportunity to people. Look at all the seniors who were living in poverty before we passed Social Security and Medicare and all of these things.
So many Republican operatives have privately said that what Donald Trump is doing is deliberate. It is all about 2020, dividing the country, pitting particularly white people against people of color, is kind of what he did in 2016, and that's going to be the centerpiece of his 2020 campaign. This is what it's going to be all about. Is it a strategy that'll work in 2020?
I don't think so. It didn't work in 2018. Look at what happened in 2018, Bill. We built a 50-state party. And the we isn't just the DNC. It's everybody in the ecosystem, the labor movement, legacy organizations, newly emerging organizations. I'm a huge fan of the indivisible chapters across this country. I knocked on doors with so many of them. And what we did to succeed in 2018 is we had a unity of purpose. We talked about the issues that people cared about most, and the number one issue then, the number one issue now is health care. Democrats are fighting to ensure that if you have a pre-existing condition, you can keep your health care. We're fighting to bring down the cost of prescription drugs.
And Trump was talking about immigration and caravans.
The distraction of 2018 for him was caravans. The distraction of 2020, he's going to try to call everything socialism. And again, that's the oldest trick in the book. Look at Medicare, look at Medicaid, look at the Social Security Act. They called everything socialism. That is such a distraction. What we're trying to do is make sure that capitalism works for everybody. And when we stay focused on the matters at hand, and I travel all around this country and I talk to people. I was in Arizona a week ago, and I met a guy whose son, 48 hours into his life, became a statistic in the sense that he was born with a heart defect. He needed a heart transplant. From 48 hours into his life, he was a person with a pre-existing condition. And thank God the Affordable Care Act was in place for his son, because they incurred 7 figures worth of health care bills.
Whoa.
And one of the features of the Affordable Care Act is that you cannot put a cap on lifetime benefits. If the Affordable Care Act weren't in place, they would be filing for bankruptcy, plainly and simply. And that's what we need to do. We must be out there talking about these key issues. In Wisconsin, dairy farmers are taking it on the chin. The bankruptcy rate for dairy farmers in Wisconsin is the highest in the nation. The suicide rate among farmers is increasing. And you know why? The straw that broke the camel's back was tariffs, because they can no longer sell their milk to places like Mexico. Mexico's found new markets after Trump did this. And he made all these promises that he doesn't keep. He said there'd never be a plant closure. And it was Barack Obama who saved the auto industry, and it's Donald Trump who presides over the closure of the Chevy plant in Lordstown, Ohio, the Harley plant outside of Kansas City, the Carrier plant in Indiana. The trail of broken promises runs deep, and we're going to make sure that the American people know those broken promises, and equally, if not more importantly, know what Democrats are fighting for, because we're not simply going to talk about what's wrong with Trump. We're going to talk about what's right about what Democrats are fighting for.
So before we get back to you wearing your DNC chair hat, I want to ask you one final question about your hat as labor secretary. You presided over the labor department, and your successor was Alex Acosta. You just mentioned him, the most recent person to leave the Trump cabinet in the middle of a scandal. What's your assessment of Acosta's tenure at labor?
Well, the most charitable word I can use is underwhelming. The Labor Department's supposed to be on the side of workers. The mission of the Department of Labor is to empower workers, to make sure workers get a fair shake. And at every turn, when it was a choice between do I protect workers or do I help employers who don't need the help, they would side with employers. We did an overtime rule when I was labor secretary. Overtime stands for the simple proposition that if you work extra, you should be paid extra. And we needed to modernize the rule because it hadn't been modernized in years. And we created a new threshold which would have given a much deserved raise to people working overtime. The Republicans worked their tails off to undo that. And Secretary Acosta was aiding and abetting in that effort. We passed a rule that was designed to help people saving for retirement. It was a critical rule that made sure that when you went for advice for your 401k program, that the advisor had a legal and ethical obligation to put your best interests first, and this administration killed that rule. There was a person who oversaw mine safety. This is a vivid example of what happened at the Labor Department over the last 3 years. This person's been there 42 years, career employee. His mission is to make sure that coal miners don't breathe dirty air and don't die or get hurt on the job. And they moved that guy out. 41 years on the job. Why? Because the new head of MSHA, the Mine Safety Administration, was from the industry. And God forbid you'd want somebody doing mine safety enforcement who was looking out for workers. At every turn, they were looking out for their fat cat interests at the expense of workers. That's not what the Labor Department should do. Instead,
they made the coal company lobbyist head of EPA, right? I mean,
and the head of the mine safety as well. I mean, it is unfair to all foxes across America to compare this to foxes guarding the hen house, whether it's EPA, the Labor Department, HHS, or the like.
Now, the question, looking at 2020, the question that everybody wants to know, Mr. Chairman, is we've got 23 candidates at this last count, I believe, because Eric Swalwell dropped out, but Tom Steyer jumped in. Who's your favorite?
I love them all. And my job at the DNC, Bill, is to make sure that everyone gets a fair shake. And we put reforms in a year ago. Our superdelegate reform, we reformed our primary and caucus process so that we would have more primaries. Why? Because more people participate when we have more primaries. And we have 6 states that used to be caucus states that are going to be primary states. And so we're making it easier for people to participate. And equally importantly, we've created a process in this Democratic primary season that is giving every candidate multiple chances to demonstrate what they're fighting for, what their values are, and there was I think that's really important.
There was a lot of criticism in 2016 that the DNC, not under your tenure, had its thumb on the scale between the two leading candidates. You believe that's if that happened, then that's no longer the case, that it's a level playing field?
I think we've created a level playing field, and every single day our North Star mission is to make sure that level playing field continues to exist. I'll give you one very recent example. Congressman Swalwell got out of the race recently, decided that he needed to bring his race to an end, and he said very nice things about the DNC. He sent an email out to our grassroots fundraising list, both praising the DNC and underscoring the importance of the DNC. Our job is to treat everyone fairly and give everyone a fair shake, because everyone, all but one of these candidates, isn't going to make it to the mountaintop. But what we have to make sure is that all of these candidates and their followers are excited about who our nominee is. Everybody has to have a chance to swing the bat. And some will make contact, some may not, but we're not throwing any brushback pitches. We're going to make sure that everyone does get that fair shake.
Bill Press talking with DNC Chair Tom Perez. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. Well, that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Arthur Stamoulis, Nancy Altman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.